It is so good to be with you all here this morning. I spent a semester back in my sophomore year of high school studying here. My family had come back from Tanzania, and my parents were missionaries, and my brother had some medical issues, so I spent a semester here at Providence, and it was such a rich time, and I look back on it very fondly, and it was so fun being back in the administration building, seeing the board that has students who stopped by, and seeing some of my classmates from then. Just brought back a lot of really good memories. I know you guys have been going through the Sermon on the Mount, this series, and so I want to tie my talk this morning into what Jesus talks about in Matthew 5 about being salt and light to the world. I also recognize that you guys are in high school, and as I think about my own time being in high school and the questions that I was asking and the things that I was thinking about, I hope that I can speak into that a little bit in ways that people spoke into my life and impacted that. So I'm very excited to be with you all this morning. That happened a couple times. About 3.5 years ago, my wife and I moved back from Uganda. We were serving as missionaries, and that was when I was asked to represent village schools here in the United States and share with people about what God's people are doing in villages in Africa. The reality is that about 1/3 of kids who finish middle school go on to high school. Those odds go significantly down if you are born in a village, and they fall even further if you are a girl. So you all are in high school, or you're about to be in high school. I'd like for one person in each row to stand up. So on the furthest to the right, I want each person to stand up in each row from each bench. Stand up. One person. Over here. You guys, one of you stand up. Take one person from each row. Okay, if I were to walk into a middle school in most of Africa, and I were to try and figure out how many of those kids were going to go on to high school, these 9 would be the ones moving on. The rest of y'all wouldn't. And so you would likely spend the rest of your days in poverty. You would spend a lot of time farming or herding cattle, goats, or whatever it was, fishing, whatever it was your family did. You guys can sit down. And so Village Schools is trying to address that need and to use that need as an opportunity to go into places where people have never heard the name of Jesus, to be salt and light to those people. So I want to read this morning from Matthew chapter 5. Jesus preaches to the crowds and he says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." I love sharing about those schools because there's all of these men and women who feel this burden, and they're going out and they're being salt and light, and people are learning about Jesus and they're praising God. And so it is just such a joy for me to share about that with you all. Village Schools started because there were a couple of young high school, Tanzanian high school graduates, not much older than y'all seniors, to put this into perspective. And they had a dream that one day, every kid in every village in Tanzania would get the chance to go to high school and hear the gospel. They had a big dream. Tanzania is a big country. It's about the size of Texas, got 60 million people. They had a big dream. The reason that Godfrey and Emmanuel got to go to high school was because people in their community had come together. They'd spent months working, carrying stones on their head, making bricks, carrying water and sand, And they worked together to build the school, and that was why Godfrey and Emanuele weren't in those odds. They were one of the few kids who would be standing up and got to go to high school. And so when they graduated, they felt this call to go be salt and light. And they made themselves available to that. It was a big ask. They moved 300 miles away to people who spoke a different language, had different customs. They had no relational capital. They didn't know anybody. It was when they first started. They went to the village of Igona, and the village was so remote that the bus driver didn't know where it was, and so they got dropped off at the village of Lugoda, and they had to walk about 10 miles to get there. That was their grand entrance into all of this. And they spent time living with the people there. They shared their life story. They shared their vision, and the people responded, and they did all of this work. They spent months making bricks, carrying stones, sand, and water. And then in 70 days, they built Medici Secondary School. And kids started to go to school. And then word started to spread, and people from nearby villages came to see if it was true, if there really was a high school there, and to see if maybe their kids could get to go to high school. And eventually the question comes, well, how in the world did this school pop up here? To which the parents would say, well, we did all this work and we built it ourselves. And so parents would go home to their villages, and they would say, if they can do it over in Igona, we can do it too. And we can do it better. We can do it faster. And this just took off. I remember when I was 12, I hopped in the car with Godfrey and Emanuele, and we traveled about 300 miles to a village in the southeastern part of Tanzania. It was very bumpy roads, not, nice paved interstates, anything like that. It was a long drive, but the people there wanted to build a school, and we showed up, and it was just this huge grass plain. And we placed the stakes in the ground. They started measuring out the foundations. They started digging it out, and people came from over a mile away. It was like ants, carrying rocks, carrying bricks, carrying buckets of water on their heads. It was a phenomenal amount of work. And by the time we left 2 weeks later, the walls were starting to go up. And later that year, that school was open. So I want to share with you guys a little video about where things are today. When Village Schools first started, the goal was 56 schools in 20 years. That happened 4 years ahead of schedule. And if ever there was a sign that when we first started out that we didn't really know what the Lord had planned, it was that the work expanded far beyond Tanzania. If ever there was a sign that God really had different things in mind, it was that the work expanded into Malawi, into Zambia, into Uganda, into Kenya, and maybe it will expand into even more countries. It's amazing for me to look back and think of where things were in 2005. It was just one school, there were 6 classrooms and 180 kids. All the staff, we were crammed into 2 houses like sardines, and it was very humble beginnings. And now, 18 years later, it's remarkable. There's over 700 people in Africa who are helping educate these kids, sharing the gospel with them, making sure that they get a good education. The end of the video talks about going and serving as a missionary teacher. I would love if you guys would pray and think about maybe one day going and serving as a missionary. I grew up as a missionary kid, and I think there's just something about being somewhere that is outside your comfort zone. It stretches you, challenges you, and it opens doors to share the gospel with people. It doesn't have to be with us in Africa, it can be anywhere. But I want you guys to think about that. One of my favorite missionaries who came out, I met a lot of them growing up there. I'm not supposed to have favorites, but Mr. Jeff was one of my favorites, and he was a graduate from Providence Classical School back in, I think, 2008 or something like that. And he went on to go fly helicopters for the Air Force and very decorated career. But he came and spent a year in Tanzania teaching students and talking English and literature. And everybody loved Mr. Jeff. He left an impact on so many kids' lives. And so maybe you guys might think about that. Last summer, I went back to Tanzania. It was the first time I'd been back in almost 5 years. And was traveling around with Godfrey, visiting some of the schools, and we went to visit one school that's a long ways away, probably our most remote school. And 4 years ago, the school was basically dying. There was 50 kids, the staff and the principal were overwhelmed, and it was in a hard place. There's no fault of the teachers, the principal, it's just a hard place. There's a lot of apathy in the community, very poor area. And 4 years ago, Frank moved to Vinton. He reached out to Godfrey, he graduated from one of our other schools. He reached out to Godfrey and said, I'm available to wherever you'd like to send me. I want to go to the hardest place, and I want to help the kids there. So Godfrey sent Frank to Vinton. 4 years later, there's almost 300 kids at the school. The school is thriving, they're building their buildings, the community is very engaged. And I got to hear Frank share about all the things that he was doing to make that happen. Every weekend, lots of afternoons, him and his teachers will go out into the community, and they'll go door to door. They'll go to churches, they'll go to sports events, they'll go talk in the bars. They go all over the place to try and get everybody to come to school. And Frank is sharing all of this that he and his teachers are doing, and then Frank starts to cry, and he starts to share about why he was doing it. And he said, when I was in high school, my father was thrown into prison, and I was going to drop out of school because I had no way to pay. And if it wasn't for my teacher, Gift, who showed up and told me to come back to school, to not lose hope, to have faith, God would provide. I would never have finished school. Gift kept going back to Frank. He kept encouraging Frank, kept making sure that Frank came to school. And Frank graduated because of Gift's effort, because Gift decided to be salt and light. And it was just, it's remarkable to see that cycle playing itself out. Later that day, I was talking with Godfrey and my father, who both knew Gift. Gift was one of Godfrey's classmates. And my father said, Gift's life would have been easier if he didn't have parents who were actively trying to wreck his life. When they heard that Gift wanted to come to school, they did everything. They take him back, they drag him out of school, have him back at home so he could help out at the farm. And my parents would keep going, and they get Gift, throw him in the car, get him back at school. And finally, Gift's parents were going to send Gift like hundreds of miles away to some uncle, so he would never come, and so he'd never come back to school. The parents kept following up on him, kept making sure that Gift came to school. And this cycle, it can just keep continuing. And it was beautiful to see this iteration playing itself out. I don't know what all Frank's students are going to do with their lives, but I have no doubt that because there is somebody who is so committed to making sure that they get to go to school, that they hear about Jesus, they know that they are loved because Frank loves them, because he cares about them, and he shows it by what he does, by how he spends his time. It was inspiring to me. When I was in high school, I was a senior, and it was one of the most impactful moments of my spiritual journey. I was at a conference in Spokane, Washington, and the main speaker was talking about this missionary couple. They were in their 50s, and they decided to go be missionaries in Kazakhstan. And they made themselves available to that. Never been on the mission field. It's a big leap for them. And that evening, the speaker invited us to make ourselves available to God, wherever that might take us. And I responded. And I will never forget that moment because it was November 11th, 2011. And so the speaker said, go home tonight and write in your Bibles, on 11/11/11, I made myself available to God. And that moment's always stuck with me. And so I want to encourage you all to do that. Every day, make yourselves available to God. Find people who are going to push you to that. You guys are at a great school with great teachers. It's not always going to be that way. You're going to go to college, you're going to get jobs, and you're going to have to be intentional about who you put in your life and who you listen to. So find people who are going to encourage you to make yourselves available to God.